Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, the rest of us, to our Summer Online Puppet Forum number 5 with Claudia Orenstein, entitled Thinking Through the Puppet, which is something a little bit new, or a new title for us. Hi, Claudia. My name is John Bell. I'm the director of the Ballard Institute and Museum of Puppetry at the University of Connecticut. And this forum is part of our summer series of online forums. There's a list of all of them on our Facebook page. You're watching this through Facebook. It'll be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. And I wanted to mention that our manager of collections and operations, Emily Wicks, is backstage. Despite having her Zoom outfit on, is backstage making everything happen. So we really appreciate that. Emily's been responsible for sort of shifting all of our programming from live events at the Ballard Institute to the online format. And we're offering usually twice weekly workshops, online puppet workshops, and this forum series. And in the fall, who knows what's happening in the fall. But I wanted to, do I have to say anything else at this time? Probably not. We're really lucky to have Claudia with us. Claudia is a professor of theater at Hunter College and the Graduate Center CUNY, or as I call it, CUNY Graduate Center. She has spent over a decade writing on contemporary and traditional puppetry in the US and Asia. Her recent publications include the co-edited volumes, first of all with Alissa Mello and Cariad, I always want to say Astles, but I think it's Astles, Women and Puppetry, which is kind of a cool book. And then with Dassia Posner and myself, the Routledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance. With me, Claudia has co-organized 3 editions of the Critical Exchange series at Puppeteers of America National Festivals. And with Dassia Posner, Alissa Mello, and Lawrence Switzky, she's been heading up the Puppetry and Material Performance Working Group for the Association for Theater and Higher Education, which is really remarkable because it's a group of scholars particularly focused on puppetry. In addition, she's worked as a dramaturg in Stephen Earnhardt's multimedia production of Haruki Murakami's Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, and also Shank's Mare, a collaboration between US puppeteer Tom Lee and Japanese Koruma Ningyo master Nishikawa Koryo V. She's a board member of the puppetry organization Unima USA and associate editor of Asian Theater Journal. And some of her interesting projects include a book, Thinking Through the Puppet, whose title we stole for this event, A Dramaturgical Approach to Puppetry. And with Tim Cusack, who collaborated with us on the Routledge Companion. With Tim, she's co-editing a proposed 2-volume essay collection, Puppet and Spirit, Ritual, Religion, and Performing Objects. So welcome, Claudia. How are you today in New York?
Thank you very much. I'm good. Thank you for that. It's wonderful to be here, part of the series.
One of the things I wanted to say in reviewing your essays in Women in Puppetry and in the Routledge Companion, that like one of the aspects of you're a really good writer. Your writing about puppetry is really distinct or valuable because I don't know, the way you talk about puppets and the people doing them, the way you contextualize the work. I think sometimes in our field of scholarship, the style of writing sometimes comes second, but I just was noticing, like, wow, Claudia's a really good writer.
Well, thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I think I do. I mean, when writing about the puppetry, I mean, I am really interested in the people and their work and just the community of people who are involved in puppetry and what it takes, especially in those books, those articles that you're talking about. These are traditional puppetry forms. And for instance, the Tulpava Kutu leather shadow puppeteers in Kerala, you know, there are several families who do this, but you know, it's not a tradition. I mean, it's a tradition that they're doing at the temples. It's a ritual performance. And it used to be that that was like the main entertainment at puppetry, at these, their temple festivals that are ritual events. And they have entertainment, and they used to have that as one of the main entertainments. Well, now there's all kinds of other entertainments. And puppetry isn't the thing that people are always coming to see. So there's a kind of, and it's part of the cultural heritage. The performers are called the Pulavars, and they're sort of scholars, and they're Brahmins, and because there's this ritual aspect to the performance, there's a kind of burden, I would almost say, of having to keep these traditions alive. And so I'm really interested in, you know, that in the end, as much as we love these forms, it comes to individuals and what they do, you know, that in the end is going to be those performances. So I'm glad that you like that, because I like the writing, because I do really value a kind of insight into the personal world of the performance and the people and being there and what the experience is.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Pulavar family and Tolpava Kuthu, shadow puppetry from India, because our last guest last week was Peter Schumann from Bread and Puppet Theater, who was talking about his Insurrection and Resurrection services. And it struck me, thinking about some of the subjects of your work, the Tolpava Kuthu work, and the Hako Mawashi Japanese ritual theater that I'm hoping we're going to talk about a little bit, and your your new book, Puppet in Spirit: Ritual, Religion, and Performing Objects. That the ritual functions of puppetry are so interesting, especially given the fact that in modern times, or under modernity, especially in the West, we've tended to step back from thinking about the ritual functions of puppetry and tended to see puppetry as more of a entertainment or education form. Although with the recent demonstrations for Black Lives Matter and after the death of George Floyd, to my mind, you know, that there's the demonstrations and their use of puppets and objects maybe more than puppets at the moment, are also a type of ritual. Or the ritual of tearing down statues is this intense object performance. But I wanted to get to that, but ask you first of all, how did you come to the field of puppetry? How did that happen?
Yeah, okay. Well, I've always been interested in I guess very stylized forms of theater. I think ever since I was young and fell in love with the theater. I used to do, when I was like 12, I was in street performances with the Theater for the New City that used very, you know, because you're outside, very broad gesture and, you know, masks and comic characters. So somehow I felt like that's what theater was. And I think, you know, and inspired by a lot of the companies at the time. And so I was always kind of looking for that. And I think that also drew me to Asian theater, where these traditional forms are so stylized and captivating. And there's a real interest in the extraordinary on stage rather than just the ordinary. So in makeup and costuming. And so I've always loved that. And then when I was in graduate school, I was working on actually a political theater company. My dissertation ended up being on the San Francisco Mime Troupe. I was at Stanford and, you know, was seeing their work. And in fact, it was kind of inspiring me and reminding me of things I had done with Theater for the New City, but in a different way, a very close company that, you know, was trained and had this long history. So
did you want to show the image?
Yeah, I will. So I was writing.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, please. You're pushing me along. So I was writing about the San Francisco Mime Troupe and this You can see that. So it became this book, The Festive Revolutions, The Politics of Popular Theater and the San Francisco Mime Troupe. And I was interested in that book in, why that they use a lot of, so that if you don't know the mime troupe, they're not silent, but they take mime from Commedia dell'arte, which was a basis for their work. They drew on all kinds of popular forms, melodrama, mime, clowning, circus, and puppetry. And so I was asking, like, why would, you wouldn't think that these, festive forms, these popular forms would necessarily be the best way to deal with important political issues like the Vietnam War and civil rights movement and things like that. So how can we think about why you would use these popular forms? What do they have inherent in them? Looking into their histories and how they may have been used in the past, where there are advantages or problems, let's say, with doing things like using stereotypes or exaggerated characters. Right. So one of the chapters was on, they did use puppets. And so this chapter 3, I just wanted to show, is From Pulcinella to Punch the Red, where I really spent a lot of time at the time, reading all these books on kind of Punch and his cohorts, so Pulcinella, Petrushka, Guignol, these kind of rabble-rouser puppets, and looking at the difference between hand puppets and marionettes in the way that they were used. So I was already kind of involved in that a little bit, but I had broader interests. I was looking at, political efficacy of theater and Asian theater just broadly. And I lived in Japan when I was in college and studied Japanese theater, which of course has a wonderful bunraku tradition. So I was always very excited by those things. But I think the turning point came for me, like many people, I think in New York, when the Henson Foundation was sponsoring those festivals at the Public Theater. So in the late 90s, or the 90s to about 2000, I think 1992 to 2000. And Leslie Ash just has come out with a wonderful book about those festivals. Yes, Out of the Shadows. I just got my copy too. And I was, really excited when the program came to see all of the fabulous and exciting looking puppetry that was coming in these wonderful festivals, and from all over, and some traditional forms, but a lot of contemporary work that wasn't directed at children. And it was kind of the thing I had been hoping for and looking for. So I went to a number of these festivals. I wasn't in New York in '92, but a few years after that, and tried to see as much puppetry as I could. And what I found was that I was asking different questions. I was looking at the puppetry and thinking, how am I being asked to watch puppetry differently from other kinds of theater? So I was really coming from a theater background, but saying, this is some of the most exciting theater I'm seeing right now, which is really how I felt. And yet it's very different. So the successes and the failures are in different places. And I really want to just talk with people about that, and I was teaching, at Hunter where I am, and I had this opportunity to teach a course at the CUNY Graduate Center. Right.
At that time, were you teaching theater history and not puppetry?
Yeah, puppetry is an elective that I teach at Hunter. So I'd never taught a puppetry class. I was teaching theater history, introduction to theater, play analysis, classes like that. And courses, I've taught courses on like political theater, things like that. And Asian theater. So puppetry was involved in those, but not a whole puppetry course. But I was thinking, wow, the festival is going to happen this coming year. And they asked me if I wanted to teach a class there as a way of kind of getting my appointment at the Graduate Center. So I said, yeah, how about a class on puppetry? And they said, actually people are asking about something like that. So it was like, great. And I had this idea that I was going to bring these wonderful PhD students, because it's a PhD program at the Graduate Center, to see these shows at the festival. And then we could use that as the material for the class and develop those kind of discussions I was interested in. Well, that was the year the festival was canceled. It stopped happening. And so it's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I had already signed up to do this class. So I started scouring the library for how to put together a PhD level course on puppetry that was coming from a critical perspective. And there were interesting things, but I also felt like what I was actually looking for, the kind of discussion that I wanted us to be having about what I was seeing, that I didn't see very much of that. And there was the wonderful TDR issue that you edited that was very good. There were a few things that I found here and there, but I just felt this big absence. So, and I had two questions when I did that class, and one for the class itself was, one of them was, you know, this thinking about how we're watching puppetry differently from other forms of theater, and also thinking about why this particular moment seems to be so full of puppetry. I mean, I think we are having this puppetry explosion. If the last kind of big puppet moment was in the modernist period, I'm sure there are a lot of other puppetry events too, but it felt like that's what I was seeing. And so what is it about our relationship and our cultural moment that's excited about puppets? And then I was hoping that my wonderful PhD students would answer all these questions for me. And
did they?
No, they had different questions and they were not necessarily interested in the questions I was interested in, although there were some very good students in the class who did wonderful things. They had their own, you know, so I felt like, oh my God, so I guess I'm going to have to start answering this question myself. And that's kind of what led me into, well, let me just see as much puppetry as I can and try and start describing it. And then, like, where are there materials that I can use to help me along? Because I feel like, well, it's so visual. And I'm theater, you know, it has its visual components, but I'm not trained in how to read imagery necessarily. My sister, who's here in the other room, is she's a curator, museum curator, and, you know, is in the world of art history. And she's got this visual training. She's seeing things differently than I am. So I was trying to look for that. I was feeling that there's so much about the movement that was exciting about the performers. And even something like Dan Hurlin's Hiroshima Maiden, I don't know if you remember that show, where he really uses the company of their sort of dancer puppeteers, and they're moving these Morocco style puppets, but also in a kind of choreography. So did I need a vocabulary of, you know, of dancers, of dance? There's so much cinematic that's going on in puppetry. Do I need a cinematic vocabulary? So I just kind of started ferreting this out, and, you know, on different paths of reading things, talking with people, going to festivals, getting more and more involved in this puppetry world that exists.
I was thinking maybe we could take away your mime troupe image. And Aretta Baumgartner from Atlanta, I believe, had an interesting comment. Can you share the evolution of student interest in your course since its inception? Have the numbers of students ebbed and flowed, or are the conversations and syllabi, or have they shifted?
Yes, a lot. I mean, the first course I taught was a PhD course at the Graduate Center, where at that time they, you know, they didn't want people to be doing practical work. They wanted it to be very scholarly and theoretical, and so it had that bent. We at Hunter, we have our own master's program, as well as an undergraduate program. And so I brought it first to the master's program when I had an opportunity to teach it as an elective again. And then, you know, there were a lot of undergraduates who were interested. So we started melding it with undergraduates and graduates. So, and of course, graduate students are also interested in making. So now it's, and then we also started an MFA playwriting program. So sometimes I have MA, MFA, BA, and PhD students all in the same class. And this might be, I don't have a whole program, I have an occasional elective. So this might be the only opportunity the students in our department are getting to take a class in puppetry specifically, although we put it into some of our theater history, Asian theater, other things that we teach. And now, because of my presence, people have a big awareness of it. I also do some projects on my own with students where we build things and make some performances. But for this class, I think that the sort of center of it for me is, first of all, if this is the only class you're going to take on puppetry, I want to give them a kind of mapping of the world of puppetry.
Right.
Where, like, people who are in the puppetry world know that the Center for Puppetry Arts is a wonderful place with all kinds of resources. We know about the Eugene O'Neill Center training program. So kind of giving people an orientation to what that world is. Right. Giving them some simple workshops. Because I'm not a real builder, but, you know, we can do shadow puppetry, we can do paper mache, so they get experience making. And at the end, they have to do either a creative project or a kind of research project. And they all come up with different things, because the heart of the class is really, in my mind, teaching you how to think like a puppeteer. And what for me that means is thinking about how material on stage is expressive and shifting. You know, we have a theater program. I'm within a theater program where we are, their acting classes are, and it's a BA, it's not a BFA, but their acting classes are based on Stanislavski, and so it's like saying, this is a world. If I said now you have a class on music, you'd know that there's music related to theater, but there's a whole world of music, and that's the way I think about puppetry. Right. So it's a little bit about, so I've pulled back maybe on some of the more theoretical discussions, although I try and, since we have so many different constituencies in that class, I try and give all the students whatever they would need. Like, here's the buffet before you of all the things that puppetry is, all the ways you can connect and relate to it. As an undergraduate who's interested in acting, where do you want to put your focus and energy? As an MFA playwright, what can we do to make this class feel like it's for you? So I try and do a little bit of everything.
And I think from what we've discussed before, it seems to me your book, Thinking Through the Puppet, is going, to a certain degree, is going to benefit from or be of, in a way, I think from what you were saying, might be based on this. I had a question in our own puppet arts program at the University of Connecticut, and thinking of our whole School of Fine Arts in general, and the particular moment we're in now. We talk about decolonizing the syllabus, or that's a term, maybe it's even a cliche. But one of the advantages of looking at puppetry, to my mind, and you were talking about the map of puppetry, is that by definition it's a global form. Are there ways that you teach puppetry that address that issue of I could be called decolonizing the syllabus, but it's also what used to be called a sort of global or multicultural, is a cliched word, but a way of decentering Western approaches to the form. How do you address that in terms of puppetry?
Yes, well, a lot of my research, my personal research, is in puppetry in India and Japan, as you've talked about, different parts of Asia. So it's always kind of necessarily, I guess you would say, global for me.
Right.
And I think, I think it almost, that's what's kind of exciting about it, and that there are interesting performers all around the world. And the books that we've worked on were kind of reflect. The Women in Puppetry book is very international. Right. So yeah, I think it's definitely, always global.
Our friend Carol Sterling asks, do any of your students continue studying puppetry after your course? And if so, where do they go for their studies?
Well, that's a really good question. I have a wonderful student who came in already, Yanni Frank, who is, I'll say Yanni Frank, who's was already like, plunged into the world of puppetry, making his own puppets. He has his own YouTube channel, performing things, and he just graduated, and he's going on to the UConn program. Yeah. And I have another student, Tian Ding, who she's an MA student, and got connected with a lot of people in New York doing puppetry. So she kind of plunged into the connections of all the puppetry community in New York and evolved performances. And she's still with us doing our MA program. And she is, she did one of the Toy Theater Festivals. She did a performance with people from, I don't know if they're friends of hers from China. It was international.
Yeah, it's a great show she did about COVID.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Very good. And I have a student who's in the Jackie Wade, who's in the she's not actually in the theater department. She's an MFA student in the integrated media arts, but she's gotten really excited about the puppetry stuff, and she's been integrating it into her film. Her final documentary film that she's working on. So people go off, use it in different ways. It's really about giving people awareness that here's this other world.
Yeah. I think that's really valuable because, it's like you were saying about music or visual art. People study visual art or music as part of a liberal arts education, not that they're going to become visual artists or musicians, but because it's part of the culture. And it seems to me some of what we puppeteers or puppetry scholars might be wanting to talk about is that puppetry is also part of the culture, and it's worth it to understand it.
I might just underline too that at Hunter we have really like a super diverse student body and an international student body. So it's always, you know, people connect to it in different ways. I had a wonderful student who took my introduction to theater class and was just inspired when I brought in puppets to take the puppetry class. And he was studying to be a nurse. He's a nursing student. And he, in the puppetry class, he kept saying such beautiful things like, you know, I deal with bodies every day, because he was already doing his internships in nursing, but this is giving me a whole other way of looking at it. And he came from a family of doctors and nurses, and he said, you know, the arts weren't really emphasized in his family growing up, and that this was really a way for him, you know, enlightening for him to think of a whole new way to connect to his profession. So
I wanted to shift a little bit and go back to this idea about, or this aspect of puppetry that deals with ritual, or as the subtitle of this book you're working on says, ritual, religion, and performing objects. Because I was struck when I was rereading your essays on Hakomawashi, Japanese puppet ritual performed by these women you met and worked with, and the Tolpavakuthu shadow puppet tradition, that so much of what we understand as the historical functions of puppetry in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Europe, thinking of pre-medieval history and medieval performance, etc., and ritual performance like mummers' plays and stuff. So much of the function of puppetry is to be involved in rituals and to offer a way to connect to different aspects of spirituality. And that is kind of different from, or in some ways opposite to, what we often think of as the developments of modernity in the West, which wants to become more secular, which wants to see art and culture more as entertainment, or you know, something of cultural value, but not deeply connected with religion and ritual. And I'm struck by the fact that you're finding ritual or the traditions of ritual still alive in these different contexts. And again, as I was saying at the outset, I was just struck by last week with the bread and puppet discussion about how Peter Schumann sees his work in a just sort of decidedly ritual way. Well, so I wondered about that.
I mean, I was the artists that I wrote about and the traditions I wrote about, I was drawn to them because they were really inspiring to me. But I was also, I've been thinking about ritual performance. And actually I was, you know, as I was inspired by them as individual things. And then I came to the realization that actually what was exciting to me, or part of what was exciting to me, was that they were like, that there was a term, ritual puppetry, and some people use it, and that these were both forms of ritual puppetry, and that's a whole world. Like that on its own was exciting. I was going to say that, that, you know, within, since I'm sort of involved, I've been involved in a lot of the things that you talked about in supporting puppetry scholarship and helping scholarship to grow, one of the books that became really important was Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter. And that's a really wonderful and exciting book because it really gave a kind of theoretical way of people understanding objects as having agency, you know, being active. But it really underlines that the objects have agency on their own, and that you don't need any kind of belief system or any sort of, you know, spirit coming in or ritual idea, that it's about, you know, looking, and she really wants to kind of rip that away from still finding this excitement of the objects itself. And Vibrant Matter had not only become an interesting and important book within puppetry studies, but in so much of the field of theater scholarship, allowing people to now start talking about objects. And then they're like, oh, they're interested in objects, but they're not using the word puppet, or they're not interested in puppets, you know, but they're interested in other kinds of objects. But with puppets, you know, we talk so much about the puppet, the object, feeling like it comes to life. That it becomes, you know, does, you know, kind of get a spirit into it.
Right.
And there are so many traditions that are about that. It just felt to me like, for this collection that Tim Cusack and I are co-editing, that was a place that puppetry needed to go and needed to start, puppetry studies, since you're using that term, needs to start articulating ideas about that in a forceful way. And also because I think when you talk to puppeteers, or when I talk to puppeteers and I tell them I'm, you know, looking at puppetry in India or some of these forms, they're very excited by that. And they just don't always, not everybody, of course, but a lot of people who are interested in puppetry don't know as much. And they're like, how do I find out about this? And so it feels to me like, you know, this is not quite an answer to your question about modernity, but it's a question about this book. You know, we were surprised when we sent a call for papers, how many people, you know, we ended up having to try and do 2 volumes. We're still waiting to get the proposal approved from the press, but these 2 volumes, just because there was so much, and some of it for traditional forms, and then some in surprising ways of things that are not traditional forms, contemporary puppeteers who are interested in those ideas and come to them on their own. So it feels like there's this whole dimension of the puppet object that has always been a part of puppetry, and discussions of puppetry may be more alive in some Asian countries still than, you know, in Western European countries, perhaps. But so it just felt like this huge realm that you know, maybe has been discussed in sort of discrete places, but maybe, you know, refresh it into the world of puppetry studies.
Is there something about puppets that's innately connected to spirituality and ritual, do you think?
Well, I mean, as I started writing a little bit about this myself, I was sort of starting to ask myself, because some of the articles or some of the things we have are kind of, I would say, I have a very broad definition of puppetry, but, you know, some of them fall on the far end where it's more like just objects. And of course, rituals are always about using objects, and somehow, I guess they're about taking things in the material world that we're here in to connect to another world that we're not in, that we're, you know, that we can't see, you know, using those things that we see and that we touch and that we can affect to affect other things that we can't. So in that way, because puppets are so much about their materiality in their performance, performativity, I guess you could say there is. And the fact, just the idea of seeing something that we know is inanimate become animate already makes us ask questions about spirit and, you know, larger philosophical issues about what does it mean to be alive. So I guess in that sense, there is always this other thing.
I wanted to ask you, I guess, particularly about the Tolpava Kuthu shadow puppet traditions and the Puluvar family that you write about in your essay in the Routledge Companion, where you're talking about the way that the Puluvar family has survived by creating sort of secular entertainment versions of their traditional shadow theater, in addition to, in some ways, trying to continue the older tradition of those shadow puppet shows based on the Ramayana, I believe, the traditional function of those shows as ritual offerings to the gods. And I'm thinking specifically of a comment that just came in from Frank Proshin, who's going to be our guest on August 6th. He says, current quandary, many small ritual puppetry traditions in Asia are endangered because it's too expensive to satisfy the ritual obligations to the spirits, which you talk about very specifically in terms of Puluvar family. The spirits have to be appeased or honored, and that costs time and money. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and in fact, I've just been doing interviews with online with puppeteers I know in India about their experience right now in this COVID moment, which is really, you know, hitting everybody very hard. And so things that were already, I mean, when I always find it a little bit curious when I travel to India, if I tell people I'm interested in puppetry, people sort of, you know, just people who aren't in that world just sort of say, oh, isn't that a dying art? You know, like right. That's the way it's known, which is a little bit.
It always is.
It's always a dying art. But there, I mean, so that's why I've been really interested in, well, who is doing it and how are they doing it and what are they doing? The puppeteers you talk about, the Tolpavakutu performers, they have, the ritual is so circumscribed and it's done at these Kali temples for the goddess that in some ways it's very, you know, because there's a lot of discussion within the field of Asian performance about tradition and transformation or transition, like what makes it, you know, when do you move too far from a tradition? What makes it, you know, continue to be a tradition? And, you know, in some ways their tradition is so circumscribed by the ritual nature of it that when they started doing other things, if it takes place outside of the ritual times, outside of the temple, it gave them more flexibility to explore these other things as a way of, you know, continuing to have a livelihood. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you know, for this particular tradition, one of the things that's interesting is that people still pay for the performances at the temples, even if they're not coming, because they're getting blessings from them. You know, of course, you know, it hasn't always been the amount, you know, the amount that you can live on and support yourself. A lot of puppeteers, traditional puppeteers in India, are also agricultural workers, and they work on in farms half of the year. So people I've been talking to that, like right now, they're going back to farming, doing more farming, cultivating fields that they haven't cultivated in a while, trying to make more, cultivate more to have something to sell as well as their own livelihood. I mean, so a lot of these, you know, traditional forms are going to, you know, have a little bit of having a crisis, well, just like all of puppetry right now.
It seemed like, I'm sorry. It seemed like with your discussion of the Pulavar family and the Tolpavakutu tradition of shadow theater, that their commercial work, which you described as taking place outside of the sort of ritual festival year, almost, if I'm understanding correctly, it makes it possible. It helps make it possible for them to do the ritual work, the religious performances. Is that the case?
I think so. I mean, I think you know, that it allows them to have a more lucrative life and to devote themselves more fully to puppetry.
Right.
I mean, some families are not. Some of the Pulavar families are not doing that, or just doing the temple performances.
Right.
You know. Some of the people who are involved in those performances have other kinds of day jobs as laborers and other things. But so the particular family that I was looking at there, Ramachandran Pulavar's family, that have gotten, you know, well known, partly because they have created this kind of balance and, you know, really threw themselves into thinking about what else could they do to be involved with puppetry. When the temple performances, you know, were not really supporting them. And I think one of the things I try and focus on there is it's also a change of mindset. And I think that's even happening right now for puppeteers in India. It's like traditional puppeteers are used to having a kind of a patron, someone who's going to, you know, say, we need you to come for this performance, whether it's at a temple or now the government, you know, in order to support a lot of traditional forms, will create, you know, puppetry festivals, and they'll hire puppeteers in, or their local village festivals. And right now, what's happening is that these period of the beginning of the epidemic, you know, like March, April, especially January, February, March, April, that time was a really important time for a lot of festivals in India. So a lot of these festivals were canceled.
Right.
And the traditional puppeteers have this sense of having a calendar. And what I've been hearing, talking to puppeteers, more people who do more contemporary puppetry, they don't have that regular annual calendar. And so they're always used to kind of putting some money aside, you know, because they might not have a show for a while or they're developing something. So it's a very different kind of mindset. And also, you know, shifting to like, I make a puppet and I do puppetry because it's part of a ritual, a part of my family tradition, versus like, I'm going to teach a workshop to people who, you know, are kids at a school, or, you know, like that's a different way of thinking about what your art is. And so I think that's, to me, what was, you know, as there's that too, you're talking about like doing the temp performances and the outside performances, but there's also a different way of thinking about, well, how do we think about our art, you know, it can do, or it's for, or how we use it.
In that, your example of the Tolpavakuthu work done by the Pulavar family is one in which the ritual work is augmented or complemented by commercial work, or I don't know, puppetry as entertainment. I don't know if that's the right word. But in Japan, in the article you wrote for your Women in Puppetry anthology, you're talking about the hakamawashi ritual puppet form that is not commercial, but has been kind of reinvigorated after a kind of fallow period of many decades, if I'm recalling correctly. And also, interestingly, being revivified by women puppeteers, which marked a change from I guess, the dominance of male puppeteers doing that form of ritual puppetry. So how does that work? How does that connect with our 21st century life?
Yeah, maybe I'll just share this picture of of the performers who do this art.
Thank you.
Because it's so lovely to see them. Can you see? Because I also wanted to say, because I was writing about the women of the performers, Tsujimoto Kazuhide is actually a really important person in this group as well. This puppet tradition comes from a background of what are called the burakumin. It means just village people, but a real outcast group, and still experiencing a lot of prejudice in Japan. And there's a long, interesting history of this form. And part of my interest, you know, so there are like bigger questions, theoretical questions. There are also like the questions that lead me to what I'm doing. And part of it was like trying to figure out the history of, we start talking about bunraku, for example, you know, at the moment it becomes this tradition. We say there was puppetry before that, and then it married chanting and shamisen playing, and we get this new tradition, and there's that history. And I really wanted to, for myself anyway, fill in all that background. And so learning how the hakamawashi puppeteers who I got to meet, you know, fit into this was very interesting. Anyway, Tsujimoto-san, his family was from one of those families, and he had been working in burakumin rites when he discovered this tradition. And eventually discovered there was one puppeteer who was still doing it, even though it looked like it had died out and nobody was talking about it. Eventually, these women who had been studying with him about other kinds of performance were the ones who ended up, especially Nakauchi-san, Masako Nakauchi, became the person who studied with the master performer who was still alive. And so this is a tradition where they go house to house at New Year's and bless the homes with their puppets. And he was doing like, I don't know, 1,000 homes. She's doing now 1,000, but several hundred homes. Still doing that, but people weren't really, I mean, they're also very remote areas, but people really didn't talk about it, you know, so nobody really knew. And he was, you know, wanted to find this out because his grandmother, he found out, had been one of these puppeteers, and the memory in the family was completely washed away so that they wouldn't be associated with this group. So he's, and in the end, he didn't feel like, well, it's actually very rigorous work to go to these houses, and I went with them for a couple of days. They're traveling up in the mountains, and Nakauchi, who does the ritual, she'll, can visit like 30 houses a day or 40 houses a day doing this ritual over and over. And everybody gives her offerings. So someone who's talking about how offerings can be expensive, Frank's question. But the offerings can also be, since she's visiting so many houses. And I think a lot of these traditions, it's not one person who's paying, it's, a whole community. The Topavakutu as well, people give money to the temples. So she's, but it's also, they want to, because she's carrying this good spirit, they want to feed her as an offering. So the women who come, they have to eat like 8 bowls of noodles a day, to be part of this traditions. Anyway, so he didn't feel he could do it, and they were very excited, and especially Nakauchi really was interested in this. And so she, apprenticed, studied with the master performer for 3 years, going on this trek with him. And she's not from that kind of family background, but this was a way of, for all of the women and Tsujimoto who were involved in this, to revive this tradition that was sort of still going on, but really on the brink of, disappearing. It kind of, I guess to answer your question, it kind of falls in right now with Japan's interest that's developed a while back, and Jane Marie Law's book on the Awaji puppetry tradition lays this out in an interesting way, and Awaji tradition is very close to this one. It falls in with Japan's interest in creating a kind of embracing of the diversity of cultural heritage of different locales within Japan. So for instance, if you go around Japan to different cities, each city now has a manhole cover that has a different image on it of its local important site, or the Kuruma Ningyo performers up in Hachioji, their puppet is on the manhole cover. They are really cultivating, there are different distinctions of like kinds of food in different regions. And there was an interest in promoting tourism within Japan. People going, Japanese going to different areas and thinking about visiting, different local cultures, and also about preserving and supporting this cultural heritage. So that's a real shift from this modernity move, I think, in Japan, an adoption of modernism that wanted it to, the idea of a nation state and a kind of homogeneous culture. And you could say that Bunraku, because it's part of the national theater, represents a sense of national culture. And some of these, there are really a lot of, I can stop sharing this if you want. There are really a lot of traditions in Japan that involve puppets and objects in ritual, in performance. And I've also been very interested in like looking into that, because there's a whole kind of world of that. And Bunraku, of course, is the most well-known and important. But
such forms as karakuri ningyo, these sort of automata, amazing automata constructions that are in street rituals. I wondered, thinking about the women who were performing this, is the fact that the ritual tradition had decreased or become moribund, did that have anything to do with accepting women as puppeteers? Because
I think absolutely.
Okay, we'll let women do it.
I mean, and I think actually one of the things that the Women in Puppetry book, the collection, a lot of those essays express, is that when you get, in a number of places where things were traditional forms, and now there is more interest in a kind of modernity in the world, and more interest in other kinds of jobs have just taken over as, when you've left behind, let me sort of articulate this well, if you've left behind sort of traditional social structures where puppetry or other kinds of ritual performers had a very distinct place, then that place, a social place, has kind of, it could disappear. And sometimes even important ones, like let's say even the Bunraku performers, or the Bunraku theater, there are now a lot of other lucrative options or more lucrative jobs people see themselves as going into. The idea that you have to do what your family did or what your parents did, you know, is out the window. And so therefore you might want to go into computers or accounting. And, you know, those are places you can make money. And so a lot of these traditional forms, puppetry and others, don't have enough people going into them. And so suddenly it opens up as a place for people who hadn't been in them before. So especially for women who may have been left out of some of these traditions. And sometimes that world of, you know, supporting, preserving cultural heritage does end up in the hands of women for a variety of cultural and social reasons. So it is a real thing that we see in a lot of cultures, and definitely, and I mentioned in the article too that, you know, this is a ritual form, and this master, who, by the way, wouldn't, he doesn't want his name and his photo shared publicly. Because that's
interesting.
It was such because of the prejudice against these performers.
Right, for low culture puppeteers.
Yeah, but at first he wasn't so interested in having a woman, you know. But then he found out that Masako Minaguchi-san, she had spent time with her grandmother, who came from a particular area where there's an important temple that he had trained in. And she became, at a certain point in her, you know, when she became an older in life, had a moment where she became a very well-known kind of medium, where people would come to her, this is the grandmother, to ask her about advice and to kind of connect with spirits who had gone. And she had this reputation. So he sort of felt that this woman that he wanted to teach was, who wanted to be part of this, had this connection to that temple he was connected to this world of spirits, and she'd be a good person. That was like a signs for him that this was.
I wonder if this would be a good time to show that video documentation of the Hakamawashi performance that you took when you were researching.
So let me get to that. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I'm going to stop for a second, because I wasn't sure if I did the sound thing.
Right.
Got to get sure that the sound is already optimized. Okay, so I'm good.
Maybe you could explain a little bit what we're about to see.
Okay, so what we're going to see, I'll show you a few little clips from this rather than the whole thing, the ritual. So when they go to these people's homes, it can take, you know, the rituals aren't that long, but, you know, this is about, 20 minutes, so we won't really see all of it. But this is the first place they do the ritual, which only people from there's a village where these puppeteers lived, and their descendants still live, and it's sometimes because of their connection with that particular, what's called a Sanjo area, that there's a discrimination about them, just because of that village. But there's a performance, the first performance will happen on New Year's at the village for the puppeteers. And then in the past, when they were itinerant performers, and that's one reason also why women weren't so much a part of this tradition, because it was dangerous for them to be itinerant and traveling. But in the past, on New Year's, after that performance, then the puppeteers would go out on their different routes. And so it was the beginning of their being kind of sent off in these different areas. But the next day, one of the very first places that they perform is at where you see this here that I filmed. Tokushima, which is where this tradition happens, has a strong indigo dyeing history. That was a big commerce there. And so there was a guild hall that the indigo dyers, convened in and met. And so that's where they do the first event. So you'll see Nakauchi-san here, who's become she's the main person who does this, and she's accompanied by these two women who are accompany her with music. She first, I won't show this part, she first goes to the altar that's in the house. She makes what are called gohei, which are these kind of sacred Shinto streamers, white streamers, and she puts them around. She always puts one in wherever the hearth of the house is. And she does a lot of prayers there. And then she brings out the puppets and goes around the house with the puppets. And the first three puppets are Okina, Senzai, and Sambaso. And these are three characters that are found in a no play called Okina. And they are there to sweep out the pollution of the old year. And then at the end, she brings in Ebisu, which is one of the 7 lucky gods in Japan. And he's there to bring in the good blessings. And he'll go around and also go to each person in the house and give them personal blessings.
So who will we see now?
So the first one we're going to see is Okina. I'll just show a little bit of that. Sorry. I had it queued up. Let's go here and we'll see Okina. Okay, and let's see a little bit of Senzai. She has these 3 puppets she has to do first. And they, if you see just here, I won't show this, but the puppets also go to the altar. And I'll show a little bit more of him moving around where she goes around the house. Okay, and then we're going to see Sambaso, and Sambaso is a fun puppet because it also puts on a mask. And one of the things I was told about the mask, there's just a picture of him before he puts on his mask, and his eyes open and close, and he looks at you with these eyes, and he does this jumping movement. And every puppet tradition in Japan has a kind of Sambaso that they do at New Year's too. Let's see him with his mask on. Let's see, I had it at 10. Around the whole house. And now, and then she'll come back, and we didn't really quite see, but she puts his feet jump up and down, and that's an important aspect of Sambaso. And let's just quickly look at a little bit of Ebisu, who is the last. So this is well, just here. Sorry, this is Sambaso again coming through. And now we'll see a little bit of the last puppet, which is Ebisu, and that is the lucky god who's bringing in the good blessings for the new year. So let's start here. So that gives you a little sense of the ritual. Yeah. And then at the end, Ebisu comes to each person in the household, and you know, the puppet puts his hand on your head and on your shoulders, giving you good blessings of good health. And then you hold out your hands, and he puts his hands in your hands and blesses you, and gives you kind of full of blessings in your hands. Right. So it's the other thing I wanted to mention is, and I was telling you about this, that the bunraku tradition that we're so familiar with is called ningyo joruri, is the other term for it. And it means ningyo, which is puppet, and joruri, which is the special kind of music and chanting that became popular in the Edo period when bunraku really, got popularized for that kind of puppetry. And it became such a popular form that kind of sound of the joruri that you hear in bunraku is what a lot of puppet traditions in Japan, even when they're doing different kinds of puppets, like otome bunraku comes out of bunraku tradition, and the puppets are manipulated differently, but it's the same sound. And even the kuruma ningyo, the cart puppet performances, now they do a lot of the ningyo joruri, but they used to use a different kind of chanting. But this performance is not using that. It's much more of a kind of folk sound, and I think it's really rich and beautiful. And the other thing is that it gives you, such a joyful, I find it really joyful ceremony. I could watch this over and over. And that joyfulness is part of the power, if you will, of that form, which is to bring blessings and joyfulness. That in itself is the ritual. Like it gives you joy. That is what, maybe connecting with good spirits is for.
And it brings you good luck too for the
hopefully good luck and good health and whatever you need. And they're called in for things like if you're building a new building, to bless the building, and things like that. So all those kind of moments. I mean,
it reminds me that puppets everywhere are so connected with shaman traditions, which is part of that connection to other worlds. Or I think of the rituals of objects that we do, like when people, where I used to live in Vermont, when you build a house, when you finish the roof, you nail a tree to the top of the roof, which is a pretty interesting tradition that people do. It's just fascinating to me, the persistence of these rituals in Japan in the 21st century. And I'm thinking of a comment from our friend Pupak Azampur Tabrisi from Tehran University, who's watching. And she says, and who wrote an article, I don't know if you saw it, in Puppetry International a while ago, about rain rituals in Iran. And she said, what do you think about protection of puppet rituals in the modern time? For example, rain rituals.
Well, I don't know specifically. I mean, she will know more about the rain rituals than I do. I mean, it depends where you are in the world, right? Some places, if a ritual puppet tradition is like considered an important part of cultural heritage, and they have a system to preserve that, then those are preserved. The Hakomawashi, they've pretty much been doing it on their own, and it was like kind of a mission, I think, from first Tsujimoto, who was so interested in really transforming a view of the Burakumin people, like that they've been outcast, and to not think of them that way, and to transform a sense of those rituals into really a kind of cultural heritage that everyone should embrace, and that the performers should be embraced, and that whole community should be embraced. So he's done it as a kind of mission, and the women who do it also. So I don't know if you're asking if I think they should be preserved exactly, or I think it's different about how it happens in different places.
Right.
And I think that's true for just puppetry in general. I mean, one of the things that I really value so much about the community of people involved in puppetry is I see that so many of the things that go on are done by puppeteers, puppeteers creating their own festivals, their own organizations, their own opportunities for performance, their own preservations, but they all would love, I mean, a lot of them would really love support, and especially for traditional forms. And ones where they're done in the family and then the support has dropped away and they're like, we still want to do this. But
it seems to me an interesting aspect of this is that these ritual functions persist somehow in different ways. I mean, Pupak was able to photograph the rain rituals in Iran, and these two particular aspects of your work are focusing on that. I did want to shift a little bit and talk about dramaturgy.
One last thing. about the ritual, because I think, you know, one of the things that I think we want to look at as we move forward with the book that Tim and I are co-editing is that, you know, this is a moment where religion has come into conversation in political and national ways and international ways. And the book really has representatives from so many different religious contexts and as well as cultures and traditions.
Right.
And so, you know, I think there's a really interesting conversation to allow to have happen of these different, you know, perspectives coming together, talking about and being able to see together in this collection these different kinds of relationships, ritual relationships to puppets and objects, and seeing it in a real kind of cross-cultural and cross-religious context. So I think that's, you know, it feels like this is also a moment where religion is being used in so many ways in so many places, you know, that we need to have that, you know, it's an opportunity to have that conversation.
And ritual, I'm thinking ritual itself is not necessarily connected to religion. There's rituals outside of religion, but there are fascinating
Part of the book, the sort of second volume, if we get into that, is more on forms that aren't traditional forms, or people who, so it's about contemporary performers who connect somehow to spiritual ideas or are interested in certain kind of ritual aspects to what they do. So it's a whole, so it's exploring that kind of swinging free of particular, you know, religious beliefs, or sometimes connected to that, sometimes not, you know, about what people are doing, or people reconnecting.
Excuse me. I wanted to talk about dramaturgy, but before that, I wanted to just pause and think about the situation of women in puppetry in terms of the book that Alissa Mello and Cariad Astles and you put together. I guess the impetus for that was a conference in London that I think Alissa and Cariad put together.
I think Cariad, you know, and they, Cariad and Alissa knew each other before, and they had put that, I think Cariad was mostly put that conference together, and I happened to be at it. I had been doing actually research on women in Indian puppetry, because that's a whole other interesting question. And they came up with the idea for the, there was a lot of interesting material at the conference. It was actually just a small symposium, but there's a lot of interesting material, a lot of excitement. And they came up with the idea for the book and invited me to be part of it, which I was excited to be part of. You know, I think there were some surprises, like Cariad received some death threats putting together this conference. Like people were really upset, like, why were you talking about women and not all puppeteers? And
really?
Yeah, I mean, it was
all puppeteers'
sort of
lives matter.
Yeah, and there was also just a feeling that there were, you know, discussions that needed to happen.
One of the aspect of women in puppetry is that, you know, when you look at the history of puppetry, there are so many situations where women are excluded from, I mean, they're excluded from particular ritual performances, like in Africa, or I'm thinking, well, we were just talking about Japan, Native American ritual, or women have rituals, but they're separate from men. And sometimes, like in Zuni Shalako performance, the men get to have the masks and the puppets, and the women are doing, I'm ignorant, but, you know, oftentimes doing rituals where they don't have that. So is there some sort of, you know, global problem that people, or that the men have with women doing puppets?
Well, I mean, I think it's sometimes if they are objects of power, there's, you know, precisely for ritual puppets and other things like that, where they're considered, if they happen to be considered as objects of power, I think it probably, those situations probably echo the sort of larger context of where, you know, women are or not present or allowed to have, you know, have power. I think there's a lot of, I mean, one of the nice things about the book is that it shows us so many different particular situation. So rather than trying to give a single global view, that the particularities of how these things play out are interesting and different. Sometimes it is for things like, as I said, that the hakomawashi, it was an itinerant performance tradition, and so it was felt that women would be vulnerable, being raped or attacked, and also that you were kind of considered a prostitute if you were an itinerant traveler female. So there were those things. The Tolkapabakuta performances also happen at these festivals. And part of the festivals that aren't necessarily the part with the puppet performances can get really lots of men congregating in public places at these temples in India, and can get kind of wild. And, so people didn't want to bring their daughters and their wives to these places, so there are sort of practical social reasons, as well as sort of ideas about power, and maybe those are also related, of where women can travel.
And is that changing, do you think?
In different places, well, obviously the hakomawashi, the whole context of it is so different. She's traveling, but she can travel by car and get to a place. She's going to places where, a lot of visiting, elderly people. I mean, the whole sort of, sense of traveling alone throughout Japan is shifted, Right. And in India, some of that is shifting as well. I mean, there's since the horrible incident of that they talk about in Nirbhaya, the woman who was raped and died, that exploded these protests all over India, really brought this problem of violence against women and women's kind of ability to be in public spaces alone and safely to a real national conversation in a way that it hadn't been before. So there's definitely attempts to change these things. And I think just things like, having, and I'm not saying that everything has changed, absolutely not, but like having a cell phone that you can get a map and know where you're going, for example, or call somebody very quickly if you need them, or be in contact, people have said that, for instance, the subway system in Delhi transformed the way women could move around that town, because there were, cars where they could be safe. It was a kind of a very different public space that they could be in. But still, once you got off the train, it could be very, dangerous to get, if it's at night, like how to get to where you're going.
And I just wanted to note that one of the really interesting aspects of the Women in Puppetry book is that it has such an international perspective. You really note that looking at the table of contents.
And a lot of the stories, for instance, of the women who are in Africa, not my area of research, but that are contained in the book, and Heather Denyer and Vicky Ramirez, who writes about her work. There really are forms where the women weren't allowed to do it, and they, had to kind of be forceful about that. And there are so many other kind of economic and social issues that they're dealing with, and then puppetry becomes a way to deal with that, to have a voice. And that's really exciting too.
I wanted to ask you about this idea of puppet dramaturgy, and when we were speaking before, you used that kavad box behind you as a way of talking about how objects or puppets help determine dramaturgy. Dramaturgy, of course, in what we call straight theater, in actors theater, is generally speaking, the dramaturg is somebody who takes the text, Richard III or whatever, and then helps interpret the text, helps the director deal with the text, and the actors interpret the text. But with puppetry, we're dealing with objects, and you had a very interesting way when we were speaking earlier about thinking about how objects help determine dramaturgy. I'm not sure if that's the way you would see it.
In the Thinking Through the Puppet book, what's one of the things I want to write about, and I talk about this a little bit. This box. It's called a Cariad. It's from Rajasthan. There's a tradition in Rajasthan where performers go into the desert areas where they're very remote and they don't have, temples. And it's almost like a kind of traveling altar. They tell the stories of different epic tales and local tales as well. And they also do genealogy. And I want to sort of say all that because actually what got me very excited when I first saw one of these and I didn't know anything about it is not necessarily specific to the way the tradition actually works and the use of these objects, these boxes. But what I was very excited about is seeing this object and how it's constructed. Because it feels to me like dramaturgy, as we were saying, is constructed into it. So it starts and everything is kind of closed up here. And we don't know what it is, but there's a kind of excitement about it. If you can see it, there's an opening here. There's all this kind of anticipation in this box. Like you look at it and you think like, oh my God, what's going on? And then there's a kind of opening or introduction, if you will. Where we first start to see some of the images that are painted on the box. And again, I want to underline, this is not necessarily how these are used by the performers who do them, but what's exciting about the building of it. And so we're opening things up, and then there's this further development. And it opens up this way. We see all of these stories, and then it opens up further on this side. Sorry, it's a
wonderful.
If you can see, opens up further this way. And then finally, there are these last two doors. And in the back, we see these figures. Let me see who the figures are here of gods, I think, sorry, I'm forgetting who they are back here. Because sometimes we get, I'm not exactly sure which ones these are. Sometimes you get Rama, Sita, and Lakshmana, but, and then you get a sense of conclusion. And I would say not just a sense of conclusion, but almost a sense of epiphany, because you've gone from this where you're telling stories where everything is painted to suddenly these three-dimensional characters in the back.
Yeah.
So what I want to kind of suggest about this is that there's a, if we talk about in the theater, and I think I try and, helpfully bring some of, hopefully bring some of ideas that I get from being in the a more of a theater world to think about puppetry and vice versa. So ideas like the Freytag Pyramid or something that you would draw to kind of get a sense of dramatic structure in theater. In puppetry, you can actually construct it. You can build it. And here, I think what's exciting is the sense that you sometimes get in a text that you get here, that the end is already in the beginning. Like from the very beginning, the whole world of this structure is all held into one. And as it opens and unfolds, you get the sense of development that you would get in a performance. And then you get a sense of conclusion. And that conclusion also takes us to another level. So I use this as a kind of example to think about, it's called, sorry, I think someone's asking what it's called, Cariad, K-A-V-A-D box. That it gives me a sense, so I use it sometimes to talk about like how maybe an object, that as I say, the dramaturgy is in the object. If we're thinking about dramaturgy as the structure of the performance, that we're looking for it in the objects and how they move and change and develop.
That makes total sense to me. The dramaturgy is in the object. I don't know if it would make total sense to my friends, working in actors theater. But this Cariad box you just shared with us, I mean, it has certain aspects to it, the structure of the little tiny paintings that remind me of Cantastoria or various Indian forms of Cantastoria. And also there's the shift from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions that you talked about at the very end. And then of course, transformation itself, which is such a central part of puppetry. When objects shift from one thing to another. But is dramaturgy with puppets different when you're looking at a succession of different puppets, or rather than like one constructed object like what you're sharing?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, all of those things that you mentioned are things I want to talk about, the 2D versus 3D. One of the things I'm talk about in the book is what I'm calling the image aspect of the puppet. How much puppetry, we always talking about the object, but image is really important.
What do you mean what's the difference between image and object?
Well, not only how it's painted and how it looks, but also I think the whole relationship of puppetry to imagery. So for example, well, here's in ritual puppets, there are a number of puppet traditions. There's some in India and other places where in order for the puppet to come alive, the last thing you do is paint the eyes.
Right.
And so we sometimes talk about bringing the object to life. If that's what's at the heart of puppetry, it's the painting that's doing that, sort of. You know, I mean, it's the rituals around it, but it's sort of like the eye being put there is what's making it feel alive. Or the way in which you talked about Kanta story. There's a lot of these scroll or image storytelling traditions, and some of them, the image storytelling then becomes, like in Indonesia, the wayang kulit performance tradition kind of grew out of that, is my understanding. You know, that we understand that the scroll storytelling was kind of first. So we say the puppet comes to life, but you could also say the object comes to life, but you could also say it's the image that's come to life. And I see that there's a lot of puppeteers right now who are doing contemporary stuff that's interesting, using images in their work, you know, like actually bringing pictures, not just picture storytelling, but pictures within the puppetry world, or exploring like the pop-up book, the place where the flat image becomes three-dimensional.
Right.
So I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about, and where the excitement comes from when a flat image becomes a 2D, something becomes a 3D, and how that can be an exciting moment in your story, you know, in the structure of what you're telling. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we only have a little less than 10 minutes left in our present. Well, I guess we could go on forever, but I wondered. Well, first of all, maybe we could address a question from Fidelis Kialo from Africa. But I wanted to ask you about your own work as a dramaturg. But Fidelis says, when you say international, this was earlier on when we were talking about your teaching, how do you get to teach a student who is not in your country? I don't know if that's relevant.
I mean, we just have a lot of students who come from a lot of different countries who come to Hunter College. Now, of course, we're all on Zoom, so we can do, I mean, I taught my class in the spring that way, and we had a lot of students who had to go home to other places. But we have a large number of students who are coming from other countries. We also have a large number of first generation, second generation, you know, Americans, people who are coming to New York.
And I might add, Fidelis, that if I could throw in a plug, the UConn Puppet Arts program has an online certificate program, which has been going on for many years, and that's another way. It's a bit pricey, but there's all sorts of interesting online workshops right now. I wanted to ask you about your work your practical work as a dramaturg for such productions as Shank's Mare and Wind-Up Bird Chronicle. How did you get into that, and how is being a dramaturg what's that work like for you, to be a dramaturg in a puppet production?
Well, those were two very different shows, because the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle was a mix of live actors and animation, projections. Stephen Earnhardt, the director, as well as puppets. And Stephen Earnhardt, the director, came from a film background. So he was very good at the projections, and we had live actor performers, there was a script, and then there were all these also these puppet elements. But there was a lot of visuality on stage. Images that were projected, like an image of one of the characters projected onto a fish tank to give a kind of dreamlike world. And if you've read any of Murakami's works, it's very dreamlike. So, I mean, I had a lot of different, I guess, jobs to do as a dramaturg there. Within the puppetry aspect was, it was a project I worked on with that group, with Stephen and the people involved for 5 years. So it shifted a lot from his interest in wanting to do puppets and starting with a lot of different kinds of puppets to basically asking a lot of questions like, well, what do you want to convey? And what kind of puppet do you want to use? And is it confusing to have 3 or 4 different kinds of puppets? And
right.
But then also the play takes place in these different worlds. There's a sort of world of the subconscious where all these characters meet in this hotel. There's a kind of the main character's dream world, some real, Tokyo spaces, and how to think about how the imagery on stage and other aspects of it define those worlds. And also, taking that very, very big book and kind of figuring out how to build that story. With Shank's Mare, which Tom Lee also worked on the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which is how I got connected with him. It was more about a production that brought together Tom Lee's work and his own kinds of puppets with Nishikawa Koryu the fifth, who is a kuruma ningyo or cart puppeteer master from Japan. And Tom had worked with him for a long time. And they were going to pull something together. He wanted something that would collaborate with the work, the traditional shows that Koryu-san does, and with Tom's own work. But they weren't always able to be together. So it was somehow helping them to find a way of bringing those 2 stories together. And also, since it was going to travel, it was in New York, and then it traveled to Japan, and then had a very long tour going to a lot of places. There wasn't going to be any language used. So it's also about being a kind of outside viewer while everybody's very involved in making that show happen, especially when they had very little time when Koryu-san was here in New York, or with the Puppeteers and with Tom all together to get things together. A kind of outside eye that's also kind of giving an audience perspective to say, am I understanding what's going on here? Am I not understanding? And I guess that's maybe for any dramaturg, but within puppetry to really kind of have a sensibility to, it's the manipulation of the puppet that could be clearer, or it's something about the way you're using the object, or it's something about the space, like to know that world and how puppets are conveying meaning and how you're experiencing that.
Yeah, the role of the dramaturg has been established in Europe, especially in Germany, but in Europe for many years, and even now in the States, the task of being a dramaturg is not necessarily understood. But it seems to me dramaturgs in the straight theater would be very surprised and challenged to think of working on a show like Shank's Mare, where there's no text, there's no words. Like that's the the meat and potatoes of a dramaturg usually, but not in this case.
I think there are people who are, because there's a lot of very visual theater in other ways these days, so there's more and more experience doing that.
Sure.
But I did just share the chapter where I talk about that with a colleague of mine who's teaches at Hunter as a dramaturg and works with our playwrights. And she was like, wow, that really shifted my view of things. And that's what I really do a lot of when I'm teaching, is trying to make people shift their view of what you're focusing on, where your attention can be.
Right. Well, we have a few more minutes, and what did I want to talk with you? I mean, I don't think we have time to get into your teaching philosophy so much. I mean, what would you say are a few important sources for you, and when you're thinking of teaching and working with students about puppetry?
About puppetry, like I said, I try to give them a little bit of everything, meaning like a little bit of practice performing, a little bit of the background, the literature. One of the books that I found really helpful and inspiring, here maybe I can share this with you, just so I can see it. Whoops. Let me just do play from current slide.
Oh, good.
Is this Phenomenology of a Puppet Theater by Jan Mrazek.
Okay.
When I first started looking into puppetry, I got really excited reading it. It's a very big, it's very long. Maybe not everything is all so pertinent for everyone. But what I like is the approach that he takes, which is to say, in order to analyze the puppet stage, the puppet experience, as opposed to semiotics, which was not something I was so drawn to. Phenomenology was a different model. And he says, well, let's go step by step. First, let's just look at the puppet and let's talk everything, about everything we see, what he calls the gem-like beauty of the Indonesian puppets that he studies.
Right.
The way in which they look like they're looking forward, but also looking to that they're in profile. Then let's look at the puppeteer. That the puppeteer, the Dalong's presence is there, even though he's the puppeteer is behind the shadow screen. And that's an important phenomenological experience. It's not intentionally put there, but it is part of it. Then let's talk about the screen and what the screen is doing, how it delineates things, what that space is about of the screen. Now let's talk about how the music works with fight scenes. So he builds out and out to say like what this whole world of experience is.
Right. And
I find that really useful, and especially when I first started, wanting to describe and talk about puppetry, I found this model really, really helpful.
Could you make the image bigger, and could you repeat the name of the author of this?
I'm hoping I'm getting it. It's Jan, Jan, and Mrazek, Mrazek. And these are some other books that I also like. I just put them up here. Understanding Comics. I love it.
Okay.
And
we're not seeing that at the moment, I don't think.
You're not?
Not no.
Sorry, let me reshare and see if this works. Got it?
There you go.
And it's been around for a long time. It's kind of Aristotle for comics. And again, when I first started getting into looking at puppetry, I found it like a really inspiring book for thinking about how you can really analyze an art. What I love about the book, of course, is that it is a comic, and it's talking about what comics are doing while it's also being a comic.
Cool.
And if I could do that for puppetry, that'd be great, but that is more complicated. But it also is very interesting to me because there are so many visual ways in which puppetry is speaking visually. And it's a very in-depth detail analysis of like how the image of the comic is working and what the image is doing versus what language is doing, for example. And so this is all helpful, for thinking about puppetry.
Great.
There are a few other things here, but I don't know if we have time to look.
Well, I think we're actually out of time. So it's very exciting. It's been very exciting. And I really appreciate your sharing your varied approach to different aspects of puppetry, and looking forward to the Thinking Through the Puppet, and also the 2-volume Puppet in Spirit book, which I hope to contribute something to if I'm lucky. And what else should we say? Do you have a final thought before we?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and this has been a great conversation for me. And I'm really excited that you're doing this summer series. I think right now with everything going on, it's really helpful to have this. I've got it in my calendar all summer, as one of the few grounding points. And you've got so many exciting people coming who I really want to hear from. They've been part of it's like my syllabus. It's like my syllabus list, the people I go to hear about puppetry. So that's all I want to say is thank you for doing this. And I'm really honored to be part of this conversation and looking forward to hearing from everyone.
We didn't get to talk about one of our collaborative efforts, which is the Critical Exchange series at Puppeteers of America festivals, which has been super exciting for me and to be able to work with you. But so if you ever go to a Puppeteers of America festival, there should be one summer of 2021, hopefully, inshallah. But maybe we'll do more talks about puppetry studies at those events.
And you mentioned something at the beginning when you introduced me. You mentioned it coming from AFA, but it's actually ASTR, the working.
Oh, excuse me.
And I would just underline that only because it's like one of the things that I feel like I'm doing out here, apart from my own research, is trying to support people who are writing about and thinking about and doing scholarship on puppetry and finding ways to do that, and opportunities for these kind of conversations.
Well, and I think the number of people and in this series is really interesting and a reflection of the way that there's more interest in puppetry studies as in the Association for Theater Research. No, American Society of Theater Research. So, okay, let me mention that I want to thank again my colleague Emily Wicks backstage running around with duct tape and making things happen. Tomorrow, Friday, am I right? No, let me see. I'm looking at the events for the coming week. Our next Puppet Forum will be Thursday, July 9th, and that will be Jennifer Goodlander. And then on the 16th of July, Penny Francis from London. There'll be a workshop on Wednesday, July 8th with Abby Bosley talking about direct manipulation with object performance. And on Friday, July 10th, a toy theater aquarium workshop with Elise Van Ass. And following that, Puppets for Demonstrations workshop on July 15th and Nature Puppets workshop on July 17th. These are all listed on our Facebook page, which you've probably already gotten to if you're watching this. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Claudia, again. Thank you, Emily. Thanks to everybody who's watched and your great questions. And we hope you'll join us again.
Great, thank you so much.
Yay.